Rashi's commentary is always super precise, not only in the words that he uses to interpret what he wants to say, but even in the words from the pasuk that he quotes as the headline for his particular interpretation. So that's why it's unusual for us that in this week's parasha, when we talk about Yamtavs, Rashi takes the words Sheishes Yamim, 6 days, which is with reference to Shabbos, and then he gives a whole explanation about what the distinction and the correlation is between Shabbos and Yamtav. So it does seem odd. He should have chosen the words Vayom HaShvi, which highlights Shabbos itself. Why does he choose the words Sheishes Yamim? We'll give a few attempted explanations which the Rebbe will be dissatisfied with, and instead we'll come to understand that Sheishes Yamim is a concept, and effectively that's what Rashi wants to illustrate to us, that there are two concepts in the way a Jewish person behaves. There's a concept of when you should be engaged in the world and working, and there's a concept of when you should desist and remove yourself from the world on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. We're also going to learn that there's a very powerful distinction a Jewish person has to make between what you want physically from the world because of the inclination of your body and what we should want spiritually from the world because of the nature of our neshama. So, we've already explained many times that Rashi's language of his commentary is absolutely precise. Not only in the words that he uses to explain what it is that he wants to say, but even in the words that he uses as the headline, the extracted words from the pasuk that he uses as the headline. Which is why we have to ask a question about Rashi's commentary in our parsha. So, B'tchilas Parshas HaMoyados, at the beginning of the parsha that speaks about all the different Yomim Tovim, after the introduction where Hashem says, Moshe, tell the Yidden about, these are my holidays. Then the pasuk says this, 6 days shall your work be done. And the 7th day should be a Shabbos of Shabboses, and you may not do any work, it's a holy day. And then after that, the Torah says, and the following are the Yamtavs of the year, and it tells us the various Yomim Tovim. So from this pasuk that speaks about Shabbos, Rashi extracts those words, 6 days. Or Pirush explains like this. Ma inyan Shabbos eitzel moyadoi. So why are we talking about Shabbos in a section that ostensibly is actually there to talk about Yom Tov? So he explains that the Torah wants us to know that any person who desecrates Yom Tov, the Torah will consider it as serious as if they desecrated Shabbos. And any person who upholds Yom Tov, the Torah will equate it to upholding and fulfilling Shabbos. So that is strange, doesn't seem to make sense. Because surely our Kosher Pasuk Rashi Mainen Shabbos Eitzel Moyadais. As Rashi himself has said, the question we need to address over here in this pasuk is, why are we talking about Shabbos if the theme over here is actually to talk about Yom Tov? And if that is what bothers Rashi, what Rashi should have then used as his headline is, the 7th day is Shabbos. And then he should have said, Shabbos? Why Shabbos? We're talking about Yom Tov. And those are the only words he should have used. Tmur Azois, instead of doing that, Hetek Rashi, Sheishes Yomim Dafka. So strangely, Rashi, instead of saying by Yom HaShvi, which is the obvious word to raise the question, he quotes the words Sheishes Yomim, 6 days. And he doesn't even hint at the fact that the pasuk talks about the 7th day being Shabbos. He doesn't even put an etc. Why? Makes no sense. Rashi, you are explaining how Shabbos is part of the conversation of Yom Tov, and yet you're not using the words to tell us Shabbos. So, maybe one way to explain it is, that's what Rashi does sometimes. He uses the beginning phrase out of a sentence in order to introduce that he wants to speak generally about everything that phrase and that whole sentence refers to. So maybe let's argue that Rashi didn't mean focus in only on those 2 words, Sheishes Yomim, 6 days, but he was using it as like an intro. I'm really talking about this entire pasuk, and here are the words of which pasuk I'm talking about, and we'll find 2 specific examples that we'll look at. We do find Rashi doing this in many places. We find sometimes that Rashi does that. He quotes the first couple of words of a pasuk or even of an entire section, And he doesn't put an etc. And that's almost as if to say, this is the intro to this entire section. Let me tell you about the section. Example number 1. Ula dugma. In Pashas Tetzaveh ala pasuk v'asu es ha'ephod, the pasuk says that you should make the ephod one of the 8 garments of the Kohen Gadol. Because of Rashi gives a whole long explanation of this. Im Basi the Farish Chule says, if I'm going to explain everything in the order that it appears in the psukim itself, you're actually going to get confused about how it all works. Therefore, I'm going to first give you an overview of how the design of the ephod should work, and then afterwards we'll plug it into the different words of the psukim. And then in that Rashi, he goes through all of the details of everything that is relevant to making the ephod. And nevertheless, Rashi was happy only to use those words, no other words, even though he's going to explain everything that has to do with the ephod, and he doesn't even put an etc. You see, it's normal for Rashi to just reference a small phrase out of a bigger concept to introduce the concept. Here's another example. In fact, Rashi is about to do it shortly after this pasuk about Shabbos, when it says Eile Moyadei, these are the Yamim Tovim. Rashi does the same thing here. He tackles the issue of why the Torah seems to repeat itself, because it says these are the Yamim Tovim twice. But he only says the words Eile Moyadei, no V'gomer, no etc. So apparently it is normal for Rashi to just extract a phrase and use that as an intro to speak about the entire concept. So why are we so concerned over here that Rashi says Sheishes Yamim? It seems to be normal. Except, the only thing is that the same logic that would apply in Tetzaveh and even in the next pasuk Eile Moyadei doesn't work over here for Shabbos. Rashi mistabek ba'atokas ascholos hakos v'inyan rak b'makom she'ascholo kileles u'chalapachos b'miktzas es teichen inyan shebo lefarish. The only thing is, look, anytime that Rashi uses a particular phrase out of the context of the whole pasuk, it's only because that phrase speaks to what he is going to explain. Like, for example, the examples we've just looked at. Rashi lo istapik ba'atokas tevas ve'osu v'oisiv gam ve'osu sa'ephod mipnei shezeu anu kudush shebo hu oisik b'pirushay asiyah sa'ephod. Let's use the example in Tetzaveh. He doesn't just use the one word ve'osu. He dafka includes es ha'ephod, because that's what he's going to explain. So he has to give us the context. Same thing here in our parsha. He doesn't just use the random word eile. He says eile moyade. Why? Because I'm going to explain something about moyade, about the Yomim Tovim. Now that's not going to work in our case, because v'ilu b'nidoin didan in our case, Rashi is, in his interpretation, going to explain why Shabbos is included in a discussion about Yamtavs. So his focus is on Shabbos. The words Sheishes Yamim, 6 days, don't in any way represent Shabbos. If anything, they represent the wording prior to Shabbos, the week that precedes Shabbos. So the attempted explanation to say Rashi does that sometimes, he just gives us a phrase and then he explains everything related to the phrase, only works if the phrase is what he's explaining. Sheishes Yomim is not what Rashi is explaining. And then we have another question. Why does Rashi approach this first from a negative perspective? Anybody who desecrates Shabbos, why not start first on the positive? I mean, we are talking over here about Yantam, and we are saying that you should celebrate Yantam. So why not start with the positive? And yes, if you look at Rashi's source in Toras Kohanim, it does actually do just that, but Rashi doesn't always quote verbatim from his sources, and the pasuk does not sound like it's talking negative first, warning you against desecration. So why does Rashi take that angle? So gam yesh l'daik b'l'shen Rashi, we also have to understand the nuance of Rashi's language. Madua posach b'tzad ha'shlila shekol ha'mechalel es ha'moyados chulei v'loi b'tzad ha'chiv kol ha'mekayim es ha'moyados chulei v'frat she'aposach meha'medam oisam oisik b'chiv shmirasam. Why, if Rashi is going to give us both sides of the coin, whoever desecrates Yom Tov, it's like desecrating Shabbos, and whoever upholds Yom Tov, it's like fulfilling Shabbos, then why not start rather with a positive, especially when the pasuk itself is talking about the positive, upholding Yom Tov. Even though Rashi's basis his explanation on the Medrash Toras Kohanim, first of all, have a look in the Toras Kohanim. It's not focused on this particular pasuk. It's talking generally about the general notion of how Yom Tov operates. And besides that, plus we know Rashi bepirushay einay matik mamora azal b'lishenim dafka, and aboifen v'signam avim toisves hasbara b'pshuta shel mikra. Rashi doesn't quote his sources verbatim. He quotes his sources in the way that is best suited to doing what Rashi does, explaining the pshat. So why would Rashi here dafka stay with the exact language of the Toras Kohanim when it seems against the pshat? The pshat is the Torah is telling us how to keep Yom Tov, and Rashi is going straight for what happens if you desecrate Yom Tov. So, maybe you'll try and answer here, because this is where you see the real distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tov. So, okay, maybe what you would think is you might think that Yom Tov is somehow not as severe as Shabbos, because Shabbos is directly from Hashem, it's non-negotiable, comes around every week, whether you like it or not, whereas Yom Tov, the Beis Din is going to determine when Yom Tov is, so maybe all of the prohibitions associated with Yom Tov are maybe a little bit weaker. Maybe that's why Rashi says, you see, the Torah has to warn you, you might think you could take Yom Tov lightly, beware, you cannot. Desecrating Yom Tov is as bad as desecrating Shabbos. And if that is really what the pasuk needs to tell us, that would actually explain why Rashi first focuses on the transgressions, because apparently that's the main thing the Torah has to clarify for us. Because we would, for whatever reason, believe that if it's just a rabbinic establishment of when Yom Tov is going to be, it's somehow not as severe. But if that's the whole motivation, why Rashi first focused on telling us don't desecrate Yom Tov, it's actually not a good enough answer. Hang on a second. If it's true that the Torah wants to highlight and emphasize for us how bad it is to transgress Yom Tov, look in the Torah itself, it doesn't seem to be saying that. If anything, it seems to be saying that the main thing is that you should celebrate Yom Tov, from which we learn that only once we understand how much the Torah highlights the value of celebrating Yom Tov, then we can appreciate what happens on the flip side if a person ignores Yom Tov. So if that's the case, if the Torah felt satisfied that it could just highlight the positive, Rashi should have only told us the positive, and we, using our own understanding, could have extrapolated the negative. It's as valuable to keep Yom Tov as keeping Shabbos. Naturally, then, it's as bad to desecrate it as desecrating Shabbos. And if Rashi had to spell it out for us, first tell us the positive, because that really fits better with the language of the pasuk. So, the question that we are really looking to interpret over here, what really motivated Rashi, is actually not Shabbos vis-a-vis Yom Tov. Rashi's bothered by something else. Rashi wants to know, why is Sheishes Yomim part of this conversation? If you want to tell me that Yom Tov is as important as Shabbos, it's okay. You could say, B'Yom HaShvi, and that's Shabbos. And then you could tell me, and now there's Yom Tov. Why did the Torah feel the necessity to tell us over here about the 6 days of work? They belong in the Aseret HaDibros, because that's what the Torah has to give us context and say, whoa, you might be all nervous over the fact that how you're going to make a living. Don't worry, 6 days you can work. Or because it wants to relate the 6 days of work to the 6 days of creation. That would fit in the Aseret HaDibros first time we encountered Shabbos. But here we already know Shabbos, and we already know the rules. Why did the Torah have to repeat and remind us that you work for 6 days? That's actually what's bothering Rashi. So the explanation is Shabbos according to Pshat, the comparison or the linkage between Shabbos and Yantam is no major surprise. You actually find that a number of the different Mefarshim, we're going to focus specifically on the Abarbanel and the Ramban, they basically explain שגם השבס נכללת באלה מועדי השם. גומר לפי שאף היא יכולה לקרוא יום מועד. That the truth is that very open-ended expression, Moyadei Hashem, special dates on the calendar, could very well include Shabbos because it is a special date on the calendar. And not only special, but B'yosa Yom Asur B'melacha, specifically because it's a day that you may not do the 39 categories of work. So that's a real Moyed. You're going to say, yes, of course, Shabbos is a special date, but it doesn't really fit in the category of dates that tikru'u, meaning that the Beis Din declares as being holy. Still, at the very least, we could say that Shabbos was like kind of a sidebar to the conversation to teach us two primary differences between Shabbos and Yantam. Actually, this would be the perfect time to illustrate to us that those are Mikroya Kodesh, which the Beis Din establishes as Yantam, and Shabbos is not. Plus, plus, this would also be the ideal time to show us that Shabbos is even more of a time of rest than a Yamtav, because there are more things that you're not allowed to do, including the preparation of food, which would be permitted on Yamtav. That's not what bothers Rashi. The fact that Shabbos is part of the conversation, we can explain. The question is, Rashi's question is, why the introduction to Shabbos? Why did the Torah over here have to remind us that for 6 days your work may be done? Mela, the first time the Torah instructed about Shabbos. Then we know why the Torah had to first. It's the first time we're learning about Shabbos. The Torah has to tell us that we may work for 6 days. So in the Torah is introducing Shabbos for the first time. You may be afraid how you're going to be able to survive. Don't worry, you get 6 days that you could work. No problem. Void furthermore. Actually, in Aseret Hadibros, there's almost this rhythmic connection, besides the conceptual connection, between 6 days of work and rest on Shabbos, like Hashem created the world in 6 days and rested on Shabbos. And Beis, not only that, but Rashi explains in that story of the Aseret Hadibros, in the moment of the Aseret Hadibros, he explains, why does it say the 6 days shall your work be done? So when you come to Shabbos, the attitude that you take should be, my work is done. I don't have any stress, I don't have any worries. So we completely get it why 6 days of work is relevant the first time Shabbos is introduced as a concept. But now we're in Parshas Emor. We're not primarily talking about Shabbos over here. We're talking about Yamtav, and Shabbos is mentioned by the way. If that's the case, Rashi says we've got a big question here. Why, when our real focus is to speak about Yantav and to show the correlations between Shabbos and Yantav, why now do we have to remind ourselves that there are 6 days of work that precede Shabbos? Skip the thing over here. The pasuk should have just got straight to the point and said, on the 7th day is Shabbos. That's what bothers Rashi. That's why Rashi uses Sheishes Yamim as his Dibur HaMaskil, because that's what he's concerned about. Why are we discussing 6 days at this point? So in order to answer that, Rashi first has to give us a bit of background. What's the background? Why Bichlal is Shabbos in this conversation? Once we understand why Shabbos is Bichlal in this conversation, then we can answer why the 6 days are relevant to this conversation. So why is Shabbos Bichlal in this conversation? To teach you that transgressing Yom Tov is as serious as transgressing Shabbos. The Chumras Melocha b'Shabbos, because the Torah wants to show us that to break Yom Tov, to do Melacha on Yom Tov, is as serious as if it were on Shabbos. Once we recognize that and we see that the Torah is looking to equate the severity of transgressing Yamtav with the severity of desecrating Shabbos, then we can understand why it first said 6 days. What's the connection? The explanation is we're not just talking about there are 6 days of work and then after that comes Shabbos. Rather, as Rashi indicates linguistically, there is a concept of 6 days and there is a concept of days without work. When the Torah speaks about 6 days, it's not just telling us a quantum of 6 days. The Torah is describing a particular reality. It's a period of time that is labeled the period of 6-day time. Rashi actually says this just in a few psukim time. He says, when we talk about Shiv'as Yomim, Shteiner Shel Yomim. It's an entity, it's a package deal of a 7-day period of time. Shmoinas Yomim is a period of an 8-day period. Sheishis Yomim is a reality of 6 days. What does that mean? What does it mean when it says 6 days shall your work be done? It means HaKadosh Baruch Hu yichid mitzias nivdeles sheshes yamim asher rak bo hu trasias melacha. Hashem created a period of time, an entity comprised of 6 days, which is the area in which the time frame within which melacha avoida is permitted. V'hainu shekol hazman sheinu b'tkufa sheshes yamim me'achol. So now the implication is any other time that is not part of that 6-day framework, any other time that has not been allocated for melacha is automatically forbidden to do melacha. That's the principle the Torah wants to teach us. It's not like there's a Shabbos and there's a Yamtavs and there's a Monday and there's a Thursday. There is a week, which is one reality where work is permitted, and there are holy days, which are a different reality where work is forbidden. Now we can understand what Rashi was so bothered by. Why does the story of the Yamtavs first begin by telling us that 6 days may your work be done? The Torah is defining for us 2 different time zones. One time zone is called the week. That's when melacha is permitted. And then there's another time zone, which is any other time that is not an ordinary weekday, and therefore forbidden to do work. Now we get it. Now we understand why actually Rashi is telling us that desecrating Yamtav is akin to desecrating Shabbos. Even though practically in terms of the consequences that the Beis Din would impose on a person who breaks Yantam, it would be different to the consequences of somebody who broke Shabbos. So yes, the punishments are different. Mikol Mokim Bichlolus Inyanam Asiyas Melacha BeYamtav Kein Sheina Nichla B'Sheishes Yamim Asiyas Melacha B'Shabbos Misug Echad Ki'ilu Chilel As Shabbos Is Chulei. Nevertheless, because Yamtav, like Shabbos, is not in the time zone of time where you may work, represented by Sheishes Yamim, therefore, if you desecrate Yamtav, it is the same concept as desecrating Shabbos. Now we get it, why Rashi's introductory headline is only the words Sheishes Yamim without even an etc., because that's the main thing he's focused on explaining. Rashi wants to show us, look, you see, Sheishes Yamim, it's a stand-alone concept. It's not v'goymer, it's not part of a conversation, and that's how you understand it. It is a stand-alone concept called Sheishes Yamim. V'hemshech hakosuv v'vayom hashvi goymer eine hemshech le Sheishes Yamim, ele Sheishes Yamim elu, b'kavonas hapasuk milocha, and therefore, when the pasuk continues, Uvayom Hashvi, it's not a Vayom Hashvi after these 6 days, you then arrive at the 7th day, that's another time zone. And therefore it's not linked by a v'goimer. It's a completely different concept. It's a concept of those times when work is forbidden, which is, by the way, the same for Yamtav. The reason Rashi only says the word Sheishes Yamim and not the words Te'aseh Melacha, that you may work, is because Te'aseh is actually giving you permission to work. It's not requiring you to work. That's not what we're focusing on over here. We're focusing on when you may not work. That's what Rashi wants to highlight. Putting it differently. So Rashi is doing here exactly what he did in Tetzaveh and exactly what he's going to do in the next pasuk. He's using a phrase which is a standalone concept that represents the entire theme of what we're going to talk about. Sheishes Yomim is the entire theme we're going to talk about, that there are 2 potential time frames. Days where you may work, Sheishes Yomim, that's the introduction. And we're now going to discover days when you may not work, moyados. And that also helps us to contextualize why Rashi first focused on the negative. Anybody who desecrates Shabbos, it's like desecrating Yamtav. And only after that spoke about the positive. Anybody who upholds or observes Yamtav, it's as if they observed Shabbos. Why? Now that we know that what prompts us to group together Shabbos and Yamtav is their contrast to Sheishes Yamim. In other words, Sheishes Yamim is when you may work. What makes Shabbos and Yamtav similar? That's when you may not work. So the emphasis is that what makes Shabbos and Yamtav similar to each other is what you may not do. So then we understand that what the Torah is highlighting over here is the desecration of Yamtav. A person who desecrates Yamtav by doing melacha, because melacha you're only supposed to do during Sheishes Yamim. Now we understand that if a person decides to do work on Yamtav, then they have degraded Yamtav into Sheishes Yamim reality, into a day which work is supposed to be done. And Yom Tov's not one of those days. So the minute you degrade Yom Tov in that way, it's no different if you had done the same to Shabbos. And then, once we see that the Torah very clearly is making the correlation between Shabbos and Yom Tov, all about the fact that Shabbos and Yom Tov are times where you may not work, now we can see the absolute correlation to the rest of the pasuk, to the rest of the mitzvah, which is that if you observe Yom Tov, it's like observing Shabbos. Okay, so what can it teach us? The deeper insight is this. We know that when the Torah says you should work 6 days, the Chazal actually tell us that that's a requirement. When the Torah tells us to work for the 6 days, it's not just telling us you may work, it's telling us this is part of how you serve Hashem. You work during these 6 days. As we well know, then in order to receive Hashem's brachas, we have to create a keli. So we actually have to work to create a keli in order to get those brachas. But on the other hand, but the reality is, the fact that we have to work is part of our physical reality because we inhabit human bodies. Because we live inside a body, that's why we have to behave in a way that conforms to the rules of nature. Like we know from various places in Emor Chazal that we are not allowed to rely on miracles and we have to follow the rules of the local government, etc. So if you live in a human body, you have to work in order to earn. But when you look from the perspective of your neshama, from the perspective of the neshama, not only is there not a requirement to work, you actually shouldn't have to work at all. The neshama is not limited by the realities of the body. But like the Rabbi says, our neshamas were never imposed, were never locked into golus. And when the neshama is not limited by the darkness of the world, the concealment of the world, the neshama is always before Hashem. And therefore, from the perspective of the neshama, if you're engaged in earning a living, you're insulting Hashem. You're standing directly in front of Hashem, hinting and winking at your friend who's working past, which is a terrible affront. And like, for example, if a person was davening all day long, it would be forbidden to do anything that was remotely related to work. So yes, the Torah allows us and even encourages us to work because we're inhabited in bodies, but our neshama is beyond all of that, and the neshama really does not relate to any of it. From the neshama's perspective, we really should always be in a state of tishbois, no work. It's those two the tension between those two realities, which is how a Jew is supposed to serve Hashem. Those days where the Torah requires me to work, I have to work because that is part of living in this world. But on Shabbos and Yantam, where my neshama is on fire, and I actually experience the perspective of my neshama more acutely. On Shabbos and Yantam have to be in a reality that is a neshama reality to the point that the thought of work is completely off the radar. There's no way that I could even consider it, let alone talk about it. Because the neshama is fundamentally beyond the limits of the body and beyond the constrictions of the galus. Eventually the neshama will even feed into and overwhelm the body, that the body itself can be beyond the restraints of its own physical reality and the galus that it lives in. Until eventually our neshama, particularly if we learn how to have the insight and the attitude of our neshama, not just on Shabbos, but let that spill over into the rest of the week, eventually the neshama takes us out of galus, literally, with the ultimate gula in the hands of Mashiach, mamish, immediately now.